For 30 years, he taught evolution from the front of a lecture hall as if the fossil record were scripture and natural selection the only language of life. He modeled skepticism like a profession, precise, courteous, unflinching. His name was Richard Coleman, Rick to the students who liked him, Dr. Coleman to the rest of the university. He had argued, published, and debated in forums where the margins of metaphysics were politely acknowledged and then put aside. He had built his career on bones and genes, on phylogenetic trees that climbed in tidy branches toward Homo sapiens. He believed in the sweep of time and in mechanisms that left traces in stone. He believed consciousness emerged, messy and late, from electrical storms inside skulls. Then, his daughter nearly died. The moment that rearranged the axis of his life was not some theatrical confrontation in a smoky auditorium. It began on a wet mountain road at night, with one compact car, an oncoming cliff, and a sequence of seconds that were both mercilessly ordinary and absurdly precise. Sarah Coleman was 17, quick with a joke, stubborn in a way that echoed her father's stubbornness, and in love with a battered paperback of Paleolithic art. The car rolled. The medics came. There was a flat line, and then a corridor of white that she would later describe in detail nobody expected a 17-year-old to know. The fluorescent layout of the trauma bay, the blue laces of an intern's sneaker dangling from a high storage shelf, the interrupted beep of a monitor in a rhythm she could feel without hearing. She drifted, she said, above her body and watched medical staff work in a choreography that made sense from that impossible elevated angle. When she came back, the nurse who had stood 3 meters from the head of the bed described an encounter Rick could have filmed. Sarah's pupils dilated. She took a breath that made the ventilator sound irrelevant. And she began to describe what she'd seen while clinicians continued to chart her vitals. The intern's sneaker was real, blue, frayed with a white star, and its position on a ledge was later confirmed by a resident who had, in fact, hung it there to keep the shelf from rattling. The resident was embarrassed, the nurse shook her head, and Rick felt the floor of his certainty tremble. This was the kind of anomaly that, in another life, he would have filed under misperception, under the limits of human memory, under the extraordinary fallibility of subjective reports. But the details were too specific, the timing was too narrow. The surgical tech who'd never spoken to Sarah before sat down with Rick afterward and listed small things she had mentioned, one she would have no reason to know, and the staff corroborated each. The reports were the kind of thing that made the hair at the back of a scientist's neck stand up. Rick went back to work because that is what scientists do. They return to methods. He reviewed the recordings, the charts, the accounts. He read medical literature on near-death experiences, NDEs. Some of it well-digested in interdisciplinary journals. Some of it scrawled in the margins of skeptical forums. He found not proof, but a stack of puzzling consistencies. Patients reporting veridical perceptions during periods of clinical unresponsiveness. Common motifs of tunnels and lights across cultures. Feelings of peace described by people brought back from clinical death. There were explanations: oxygen deprivation, medication effects, confabulation. Those explanations had merit. They did not, however, explain everything Sarah had seen. The knowledge that one can be wrong and still be a good scientist lived in him as both threat and invitation. He began to read beyond his usual journals. He read about cases compiled in decades of research that some called methodologically suspect and others called provocative. He read Ian Stevenson's work, cautiously, because Stevenson appeared repeatedly in the bibliographies of papers that examined memory and return claims. Stevenson, a psychiatrist, had cataloged hundreds of reports of children who remembered previous lives, including details that could be checked against historical records. The mainstream scientific community contested his conclusions. That mattered to Rick. He respected the discipline's ability to push back. Yet he could not simply sweep the cases away without explanation. If the data were flawed, why did so many independent reports show the same oddities? The first weeks after the hospital stay were a strange topology. Rick's life folded into two zones: the day, harsh fluorescence, lectures, grant applications, and the night, where he lay awake reconstructing possibilities and trimming them into hypotheses. He taught his classes the same way. He cited Darwin with the same reverence he always had. He kept his tone careful, his references rigorous. But behind the veneer of normalcy, there was a new ache, a question that would not be dismissed by method or métier. What if consciousness was not purely a late emergent property of evolved neuromachinery? What if something else was true, something that could be suggested by patterns but not captured in a single experiment? He found himself humming a metaphor he knew to be dangerous for a scientist, an intuitive image from his childhood days with an old shortwave radio. The brain, he mused, might be more like a receiver than a generator, tuned to a range, filtering a signal that existed beyond the hardware. The analogy was imperfect and easily misunderstood. You could not use a metaphor to replace data, yet metaphors can steer an honest inquiry into new questions. Was consciousness broadcast and the brain a decoder? Or was that simply a seductive story for an anxious father? 2 months later, the mountain road produced a different kind of phenomenon altogether. The night was clear, the air carrying the cold brightness of high-altitude stars. Rick and Sarah had driven out of town for dinner, to the overlook they had loved when she was little. She wanted to show him a sketch she'd been working on, something she said might explain why the old art is alive. They parked. Sarah stepped out, pulling the collar of her jacket tight against the wind. Rick reached into the trunk for a blanket, and, in the small, attentive way that fathers and daughters sometimes share, began to tease her about her artist's stubbornness. The light came like a cylinder of intention. It touched the road before they noticed its presence. Not a flash, but a slow bloom of iridescent blue that smelled faintly metallic, as if the air itself had been charged. The car stalled. The radio clicked to static. Rick felt the hair along his arms lift in the manner of static electricity. He stepped forward. He remembered later the mannerisms of his own body, the biological details that a scientist notices when the catalog of normal responses fails to explain them. Pupils dilating in a second, an internal sense that the muscles had been asked to move and refused, a curious sense of buoyancy that made the world a little too far away. He did not scream. He stood, and the car and Sarah were bathed. They were not alone. Inside the craft, if that word helps the frame, the air did not smell like anything from Earth. It felt like the absence of smell. The geometry was wrong in a quiet way, lines bent at angles your eyes did not expect. A being came forward, pale gray skin, elongated head, eyes that were too deep and too bright. It was the image the public had for decades associated with alleged encounters. But whatever pop culture familiarity you brought with you mattered less than the fact of presence, the sense you get when something addresses you that isn't speaking in the ordinary way. He did not hear words. Language as Rick had studied it in brackets of linguistics and phonetics did not enter. There was, instead, a transmission in the mind. Not auditory, not visual in the ordinary sense, but more like a placing of meaning into his thoughts. He recognized it almost immediately as the same interior modality Sarah had used when describing the corridor of her NDE. The being did not demand assent. It offered images and propositions, compressed like chapters of a book read at high speed, yet perfectly clear. You call it evolution, the alien thought. No sound, only meaning. We call it the shaping of vehicles. The body is a scaffold. The mind, you assume, grows from matter. This is one timeline. There is another. Rick had the reflex of a scientist to parse the transmission with the cold apparatus of hypothesis testing. He cataloged the information even as he experienced it. There were holographic projections, not like the crude video of a museum display, but dense overlays that wrapped around the room. Oceans boiled and calmed. Green mats of life spread and retreated. Single-celled forms fused into new architectures. The presentation moved at impossible speeds, compressing billions of years into minutes. He could see cilia become fins, become limbs, skulls elongate and shorten, jaws recede as cultural tools appear to compensate. It was a condensed, cinematic Darwinian cascade, familiar patterns laid bare with forensic clarity. Then the light shifted, the film changed, the color palette warmed into golden tones. The golden timeline was not a replay of biology. It unfolded as points of brightness moving across an unbounded plane, each point a bright, concentrated awareness. They did not look like bodies. They looked like intentions. Thin filaments stitching themselves, choosing apertures of entry into the material world at particular moments when the scaffold allowed for their habitation. The image was not metaphorical in that hallucination way. It bore the crispness of the earlier evolutionary montage, but carried with it a different grammar. Selection, yes, but selection of entry, not only of mutation. We did not teach them how to build this vehicle, the alien thought. We do not claim credit for the shaping of bones and brains. What we share is a third-order observation. The work of your planet created a set of viable vessels. When vessels reached a threshold, structural integration, social complexity, symbolic capacity, points of consciousness aligned and entered. Rick's scientist brain protested. The alien's transmission did not present data in the way papers and labs do. It presented patterns. It offered an interpretive frame. Physical processes sculpt bodies. Some non-material reality apportions conscious points that inhabit those bodies under conditions that favor complex integration. Roughly around 300,000 years ago in the timeline the alien showed him, when behaviors erupted that no longer fit tidy evolutionary pacing. Ritual burials, symbolic carvings, the earliest sparks of narrative thought captured in ochre and charcoal. The word disturb thrummed in Rick's chest, not as melodrama, but as a diagnostic. His categorization systems were being refashioned. For someone whose intellectual life had been nested in sequential causality, the alien's suggestion of a dual origin was like finding a hidden chamber under a well-mapped house. It did not say that Darwin was wrong. It said that Darwin had described one very visible thread of a broader weave. "And why show this to me?" Rick mentally asked. The thought felt rude and small under the sweep of images. The answer arrived not as explanation, but as a relation. You trusted evidence. You looked for falsifiable claims. And you were blind to certain forms of evidence, the alien thought. It did not mock. It only set a mirror of possibilities in front of him. If the image of consciousness as a broadcast did not convince him, the alien shifted again to an operational analogy that landed with the domestic familiarity of the old shortwave radio in his mind. Think of your brain as an antenna and a filter. A strong signal will render without help. A weak signal needs a tuned, coherent receiver. Damage to the receiver will alter the clarity and content of what is received. But the presence of reception in extremis suggests a source beyond the apparent causal chain of neural computation. The visualization that accompanied the thought was elegant. A cone of golden light intersecting with the gray mass of a brain. A limiter reducing a vast luminous field into the narrow output a human expresses. Rick had taught students to be suspicious of metaphor because metaphors can mislead. He also knew that if you wanted to build a bridge between disciplines, you often started with the most communicative scaffolding you could find. He filed the analogy in the mental pocket reserved for provisional tools. He asked clinical questions in the silence that followed because the scientist's habit of interrogative curiosity is hardwired into you once you have worn it every day for decades. What the alien showed him next was not a neat argument. It was a tapestry of anomalies, vignettes, documented oddities, patterns. Some of these he had already read about in journals that orbit the interstice between orthodoxy and curiosity. Others were new to him, or at least new when arranged in the particular constellation the alien painted. The holograph unfolded vignettes like cards laid on a table. There was the image of a patient, flat EEG, eyes closed, who described, upon returning, a detail in a hospital corridor 3 floors above, a small red plastic toy wedged between radiators. The novelty lay in the verification. Hospital staff later confirmed the toy had been placed there 2 nights before and had gone unnoticed. There was a child in Southeast Asia who, at age 3, spoke detailed memory of a life in a village 200 miles away, recounting a home layout and a family name that could be traced in local records. There were prehistoric caves exploding with symbolic objects well before the other signs of complex tool use could have accounted for them. There were cases of terminal lucidity, the weird clarity of the dying who suddenly can greet family with perfect memory and lucid speech after weeks of cognitive decline. Each vignette was cleanly summarized in the projection, a datum, an incongruence with materialist expectation, a suggestion that something in the story did not fit. The alien did not offer these as proof. It offered them as pattern. A constellation that includes veridical perceptions during clinical death, reports of conscious continuity across lifetimes consistent with reincarnation-style data, sudden emergent symbolic behavior in the archaeological record, and the brain's surprising plasticity in extreme cases that allow consciousness to function despite severe structural impairment. The alien's mental voice was patient. "You do not need certainty," it conveyed. "You need coherence. The weave may be imperfect, but the threads cross consistently." Rick found his skepticism resisting and then softening. He cataloged counter-arguments even as the images folded away. Confabulation, confirmation bias, fraud, suggestibility. He knew the rules of skepticism well enough to map them onto the vignette set. Where the alien's presentation succeeded, where it unsettled him most, was in the patterning. Independently reported anomalies across cultures and eras. Cases that suggested veridical perception from impossible vantage points. And shifts in behavior in prehistory that seemed to require an explanatory vector beyond incremental adaptation. He woke up in a tent pitched awkwardly by an empty parking lot, the sky still carrying echoes of the ship's aurora. Sarah was asleep beside him, breath steady, her hand curled around the blanket. He felt as if he'd been given a question and then left to wrestle with answers that neither the academy nor the hospital could supply on their own. Back in his office, hours later, and after he had called a meeting with a colleague under the pretext of discussing a grant, Rick scribbled diagrams on scrap paper. He drew a cone intersecting with a skull and labeled it filter. He sketched a timeline with 2 parallel tracks, the biological accretions rising on one side, luminous points aligning on the other. He was not ready to lecture on this. He was not ready even to confide in himself fully. Yet the skeletal beauty of the model demanded a kind of attention that his intellect both dreaded and craved. When Amanda registered for his advanced seminars the following semester, she was 17 and luminous in a different way, an attentive student who wrote in the margins of her notes things like, "What about interior life?" and "How to account for meaning." She showed up the first day wearing an oversized jacket and a notebook thick with questions that did not belong to any particular discipline. Rick watched her from the front of the lecture hall and felt a pang of recognition. Sarah's curious persistence, his own youthful discomfort with kitey explanations. He had not planned to change his syllabus. Darwin would still stand at the center. But the encounter on the mountain and the far stranger experience in the ship had introduced a fissure in his teaching that would not be sealed by more fossil plates. 2 weeks into the term, he told the class a story. He told it with the restraint of someone who understood professional risk, but also the moral obligation to model intellectual honesty. He described the debate over the origin of consciousness, naming the orthodox positions and the contested observations, signaling clearly that he was not endorsing supernaturalism but inviting students to think about the limits of materialist explanation. Amanda's hand shot up. Her question, simple, blunt, was a small flint striking a larger chamber of thought. If consciousness is not purely generated by the brain, does that change how we study it? Rick answered by giving them the receiver metaphor and showing the holograph of two timelines he had sketched on the whiteboard, biology and luminous origin, phrased not as fact but as a working model worthy of rigorous interrogation. He cited the kinds of cases that made him uncomfortable and the researchers whose names appear when you read beyond the orthodox journals, making sure to flag controversy and scientific pushback. He did not dramatize Sarah's NDE. He did not mention the ship. There are protocols for disclosing experiences that risk derailing an academic career. He respected them. He opened the floor, and from the back of the room, a quiet conversation began among students who had never before been invited to treat metaphysics with methodological curiosity. Word traveled in ways that academic memos avoid. A former student who worked for a local podcast reached out to Rick with a gentle conspiratorial email. "If you ever want to talk about out-of-the-box ideas, I'm listening," it said. The email felt to Rick like the first small crack in his professional armor. Speaking publicly about what he had seen could cost him credibility among peers who measured ideas by citation counts and replication power. Yet the thought of spending the rest of his life shaping young minds without acknowledging the questions that had arrived in his own thinking felt dishonest. Dr. Stevens, Richard's friend turned intellectual antagonist across countless panels, was not subtle about his irritation. Stevens epitomized the type of materialist rigor that had kept the discipline healthy. He demanded clarity about causal mechanisms and resented the incursion of poorly substantiated metaphysical claims into scientific curricula. When Rick raised the possibility, however tentatively, of considering consciousness beyond a purely emergent model, Stevens's rebuttal was precise and immediate. "Place your bets on the replicable," he urged. He recited the litany of confounds and the importance of methodological conservatism. Rick respected Stevens. He also felt, more acutely now, the social cost of changing one's mind publicly. Scientists are not only persuaders, they are guardians of certain epistemic boundaries, and to cross them without evidence is to risk damaging the trust of peers and students alike. Yet there was also an ethical dimension to his silence. How could he teach students to think ethically about human subjects, about suffering, about life and death, if he refused to even model intellectual humility in the face of data that troubled him? The question was practical and moral, and it kept him awake long into nights that had once been easy. He began to build a dossier, not to prove the aliens' claims, but to see whether a pattern existed that warranted deeper study. He collected case reports with the slow, cautious appetite of a scientist who knows how confirmation bias can seduce a mind. He only accepted reports that offered verification, cross-checked evidence, and multiple independent witnesses. He appended to each entry a note of skepticism, alternative explanations, methodological limitations, the margin of interpretive error. The list grew. It was neither neat nor conclusive. It did, however, resist the simple dismissal Stevens demanded. Sarah noticed the change in him not as an intellectual drift, but as a softening. The rigid tutelage that had defined their arguments over dinner about evidence, causation, the necessity of replicability, relented into something more conversational. They argued less and listened more. He began to ask her about what her experience had felt like beyond the content. The moral taste of the place she described, the permission it seemed to give her to stop fearing the small cruelties of teenage life. She spoke about feeling seen, which he accepted as a kind of testimony that could not be categorized by bone or gene. The most intimate consequence of the event was not the change in his hypothesis about mind and matter. It was the alteration of a father-daughter relationship that had always been generous yet contained. As part one of his internal reckoning wound forward, the world outside came to feel slightly different. A lecture could now trigger a memory of the golden timeline. A campus debate could produce in his mind a mental image of points of light aligning with viable neural scaffolds. He worried about the language he used in hallways and in papers. He did not want to abandon clarity. He also did not want to let the fear of being misunderstood silence an inquiry that, if nothing else, had human consequences. Late one night, alone in his study, he pulled up a scanned photograph of a ochre-painted cave panel he'd seen in another life. Primitive hands stenciled in negative space. The image burned with its own inexplicable insistence. Something in it matched the golden timeline the alien had shown him. The arrival of symbolic capacity, the sudden urgency with which humans began to make marks and arrangements that had no obvious utilitarian purpose. Why would a species expend resources making marks with no immediate survival benefit? Darwin's answers about sexual selection and social signaling are powerful and productive, Rick knew, but the timing and suddenness of the shift interest him. Was there another dimension contributing to the impulse towards symbolic life? He turned the receiver metaphor over and over until it began to feel like a tool rather than an escape. If consciousness were in some sense prior, if it could persist or be veridical across interruptions of neural activity, then the ethics of how we treat each other might require a different framing. Even to entertain that possibility demanded humility, a refusal to claim knowledge where none was forthcoming, and a willingness to let mystery sit at the table of inquiry. One evening, during a faculty meeting, a junior colleague, someone in cognitive neuroscience, presented a paper on hemispherectomy patients who, after removal of one cerebral hemisphere, nonetheless retained remarkable aspects of personality, memory, and creativity. The room buzzed with technical questions. Rick paid attention, not because he intended to be confrontational, but because the data expanded the list of anomalies he was assembling. The brain's plasticity suggested that structure and function can float apart in ways our models do not always predict. Such observations were not miraculous in a colloquial sense. They were biological facts that compels reinterpretation of narrow models. They were also precisely the sort of facts that a holistic hypothesis, one that treats the brain as an interface, would need to account for. There were critics who would say this is all graceful hand-waving, a romantic attempt to stitch mystery with myth. Rick understood that critique. He also knew that science's history is the history of unwinding mysteries and exposing deeper mechanisms. Sometimes that process requires sitting with anomalies long enough to see their shape. This is what the alien had suggested to him without preaching. See patterns. Do not conflate daring hypothesis with established proof. On a rain-softened afternoon, Rick took his daughter to the archives to see an exhibit of prehistoric ornaments. She pressed her palm to the glass and traced the profile of a small carved figurine with an attention that felt like prayer. There was nothing explicitly supernatural in the scene, just two people pausing to witness a remnant of human care. Yet the ordinary tenderness of the gesture felt charged with new significance for Rick. He had not yet published anything, not even a cautious op-ed about the limits of reductionism. He was not about to claim a grand synthesis. He could not. But the arc of his interior life had been bent, and he found himself wanting to live into that bend with care. The alien's visit, whether a mind-shifting hallucination or an encounter he would one day have to defend or deny, had placed two things on the table. First, a model that layered a luminous line of consciousness atop the material narrative of evolution. Second, a series of anomalies that, taken together, suggested the need for a broader conversation. He could have kept the story private and let years pass in the relative security of disciplinary orthodoxy. Instead, the images he had been shown returned with a persistence that felt like an obligation. It was late when the memory of the craft visited him again. He lay awake, tallying what he had seen and what the alien had suggested, and a new worry rose like a tidal shadow. If consciousness did predate biological organization in the way the projection implied, What would that mean for the way communities make moral claims? For the way we comfort the grieving? For the way courts judge responsibility? For the way schools teach children to think of themselves? These were not academic musings. They were practical, messy, tailing into policy and care. He imagined Dr. Stevens rolling his eyes at such extrapolations. Still, Rick could not shake free of them. The ship, the alien, the golden and gray timelines, these were images heavy with implication. He had brought back more than a question. He had brought back scenes that pushed at the lattice of his public and private life. The project he began, careful, slow, and ethically cautious, was not to prove the alien right. It was to see whether the pattern the alien had shown him could be undergirded by a constellation of reasonably verifiable anomalies, each treated with skeptical rigor. At dawn the next day, as the campus filled with students seeking coffee, he closed his office door, pinned a loose stack of photocopies to a bulletin board, and began to sort them into piles. Veridical perception reports, reincarnation-style cases with archival corroboration, cognitive anomalies, and archaeological surprises. Each pile bore flags, methodological caveats, names to contact, labs to reach out to. The work felt both like preparation for a lecture and like the beginning of a confession. He did not know the shape of what would come next. He only knew the arc of what had happened so far. A daughter's near-death experience that had introduced an unignorable datum into his life. An encounter with a being who offered a layered account of origins. And the slow, careful assembling of a dossier that might help him and others take seriously an uncomfortable question without abandoning the tools that had made modern science trustworthy in the first place. The title that would come to ripple across blogs and forums, the phrase an editor would one day choose for its click and its provocation, was already living in the back of Rick's mind. The alien answer to human evolution. What they revealed would disturb you. Late that night, with the city's lights like distant constellations, he reviewed his notes. The hospital timeline, Sarah's verified details, the sketches of the two-line model, the alien's receiver analogy. He breathed through the uneasy, productive tension that comes when method meets mystery. In the quiet, a small image began to recur. A human figure overlaid with a faint shimmer of gold, not as proof, but as a possibility. If it was true that the human organism hosted a point of pre-existing consciousness, then the ethical imagination would have to shift in small, practical ways. Compassion would be reinforced not as sentiment, but as epistemic prudence. Education might become an art of helping encased awareness remember why it chose this vessel. He did not trust easy narratives. He would not offer them. He would, however, keep the door open to the list of anomalies and to the discipline that insists on scrutiny. The alien's answer had disturbed him. That disturbance, at present, felt like the first honest step toward a question that mattered to more than his academic reputation or his daughter's memory. It mattered to how people imagined themselves and each other. As dawn leaked into his office, Rick packed his notes, printed the neurologist's reply, and placed them into a folder labeled Inquiry. He had crossed a threshold. He had invited the academy to engage with things that, for many, would be better left unspoken. The action was small and careful: an email, a meeting, a promise to document, to call upon peers for critical eyes. The ship and its projection had closed like a book, but the sentences it left him with were both a warning and an invitation. What will you do when you learn your mind may predate your body? The question was not rhetorical to him anymore. It toured the edges of his days, a persistent, exacting guest. He paused at the window and watched two freshmen walk by, arguing about lab schedules. They did not know him. They did not know that their ordinary footsteps sat atop a layered past that, for some minds, did not start with gestation, but with an origin point outside of earthly matter. He felt a strange kinship with them, a protective wanting that had nothing to do with ideology. Maybe, he thought, the most important outcome of all this would not be to settle cosmic debates, but to alter gently the moral texture of ordinary things. Bedside conversations, courtroom testimony, the way teachers hear children's claims about past lives. If nothing else, and it was a large if, this model demanded we treat eyewitnesses and illogical claims with a level of care that defaulted to humanity rather than derision. He put the folder in the drawer, laid his head back against the chair, and thought about what it would take to make this exploration public without selling it as revelation or hiding it as private anomaly. He envisioned a series of carefully structured inquiries, clinical audits of veridical perception, cross-cultural surveys of reincarnation-style reports, meetings with archaeologists about the timing of symbolic behavior. He imagined the scorn of Dr. Stevens, and he imagined, too, that beneath the scorn might be a scientist's love for being proven wrong in a way that refines rather than ruins. A message remained, etched like a primer in the center of his mind by the ship's telepathic demonstration. Look for pattern, not proof. Be rigorous, not reductive. The alien had not come to proselytize. It had come, in its terse, inscrutable way, to gesture at a hypothesis that might reframe how we think about origins. Whether the world accepted such a reframing was not a matter for the craft to ensure. That responsibility lay with those who would carry the evidence forward. He rose, made coffee, and prepared to go to the hospital to review Sarah's charts with the neurologist. It was a small, practical step in a long, demanding conversation. The disturbance the alien had introduced into his worldview was only beginning to ripple outward, and already it had begun to change how he moved through the world. Slower in some ways, more attentive in others, and haunted by a persistent, disquieting affordance. What if the mind that asks why arrived before the bone that it inhabits? He took a final look at the sketchboard where he'd drawn the two parallel timelines. The gray timeline of bones and the golden thread of luminous points set side by side like a map with two keys. He felt the pressure of a decision that was not yet his to make, to publish, to teach, to remain cautious, or to keep this as a private taxonomy of wonder. For now, he would choose the slow path: document, verify, invite critique. He would treat the alien's answer not as an ending, but as the opening of a research program that might, at best, change the way we ask certain questions. Outside the window, a bus hissed. 2 students laughed, and the campus resumed its ordinary motions. Inside, in the drawer, the folder marked Inquiry waited. He closed the drawer and left the office, feeling the weight of possibility fold into his steps. The neurologist he had contacted met him in a small conference room adjacent to the neurophysiology lab. The woman, Dr. Elena Marquez, moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent too many years translating noisy biology into clinical decisions. She read the redacted notes without drama, then asked the questions Rick had feared and hoped for: timelines, drugs administered, timing of electrical flatlines. She wanted to see original traces, not summaries. They spent the better part of a morning in the dim glow of the EEG monitors. Rick watched her face more than the graphs. She was a reliable skeptic, the kind of clinician who delighted when an anomaly boiled down to instrument error. When she looked up and said, "This case is unusual," her voice was small with the same professional amazement Rick remembered feeling the first time he'd held a fossil that didn't fit the pattern. He understood he'd found an ally for careful inquiry, not a convert. The details mattered. The EEG showed an extended period of suppressed cortical activity consistent with clinical criteria used to define very low consciousness states. Clinically, Sarah had met several thresholds that make the presence of complex perception unlikely under standard models. The timeline in the anesthetic chart matched the nursing notes. There was indeed a window in which her body showed little measurable electrical activity. That did not mean the brain had been inert in every way. The limitations of surface EEG and microcircuit dynamics are well known. But it did narrow the interpretive space. Dr. Marquez agreed to co-author a careful audit of the case, with the understanding that they would present the data with full caveats and methodological transparency. That audit became the first technical paper Rick would not meekly tuck away. It read like an exercise in discipline, clear methods, conservative language, and a conclusion that could be summarized in a sentence both honest and unsettling. This single case does not prove non-local consciousness, but it reports veridical perceptions during a period that invites further controlled study. The paper went out to reviewers who treated it with the polite suspicion Rick had come to expect. Some reviewers flagged alternative explanations, undetected microstates, spontaneous recall that had been cued later. Others called for prospective protocols designed to test for veridical perception under controlled conditions. What the audit did, more than resolve anything, was expand the conversation. A small coalition formed. Dr. Marquez, a careful-minded anesthesiologist who agreed to design stricter perspective monitoring, a social scientist interested in memory confabulation, and Rick, who could no longer pretend he had not been affected by what his daughter had reported. They designed a pilot study, modest, ethically robust, which set out to place hidden targets in clinical spaces and to institute high-resolution monitoring during high-risk procedures. It was a study framed for methodological conservatism, not headline-grabbing revelation. The design was intentionally boring so that if it ever produced an anomaly, the anomaly would be harder to explain away. Parallel to the clinical work, Rick pursued conversations with archaeologists. He sat in rooms thick with dust and patients, where specialists pointed at dates and dated sedge buried under layers of soil. The consensus was not unanimous. There are always debates about how to interpret marks on a cave wall or the ritual significance of burial goods. What most researchers acknowledged, however, was a compelling clustering of symbolic behavior at a period that modern dating places near what geneticists and paleoanthropologists sometimes call the behavioral emergence of our species. A set of practices and artifacts that radiocarbon and uranium series dating suggest intensified roughly within a window that centers on a few 100,000 years ago. Behavioral modernity is messy, an archaeologist told him over tea. It's not a switch you flip, but there are pulses, moments where things cascade. She showed him panels of ochre, beads strung from shells, arrangements that demanded time and intention. "Why now?" she asked rhetorically, tapping a photograph of a burial with ochre sprinkled over bones. Rick thought of the alien's golden timeline. He resisted calling the pattern proof. Instead, he recorded the archaeologist's precise skepticism and the data she would let him reproduce in footnotes. When Rick began to build his dossier into something publishable, he knew he needed to bring in the historical researchers who had worked on reincarnation-style cases without flattening the controversy. He read more on Ian Stevenson, not as a convert, but as a historian of an awkward field. Stevenson's work, Rick wrote in his margin notes, was a catalog of intriguing reports. Children who claimed previous lives with details that could be checked, claims of walking wounds that matched historical injuries, and localized memories that an objective researcher could sometimes trace to real records. The mainstream psychiatric and anthropological communities had raised methodological red flags, suggestibility, cultural transmission, and researcher bias among them. Rick acknowledged those critiques in his notes and still kept the studies in his file because patterns of recurrent reports across cultures and investigators posed a question that curiosity could not ignore. He met a living colleague of Stevenson at a modest office in the university library. The scholar, an older anthropologist who had often walked the controversial edge, warned Rick that working with such materials required humility and patience. "You will be tempted by narrative," she said, "and narrative is seductive." She urged meticulous cross-checking, verified statements, timing that precluded collusion, and a high bar for archival corroboration. Rick thanked her and filed her admonitions in his careful drawer. Meanwhile, Amanda, who had lit something in Rick's lecturing heart, began a student project that quietly sent ripples through campus. She proposed a cross-disciplinary seminar that paired neurobiology with ritual studies, inviting students from anthropology, philosophy, and the cognitive sciences to read outside their comfort zones. The proposal was modest, just a small credit-bearing seminar meant to test whether students could hold multiple explanatory frames without collapsing into relativism. Rick agreed to be a mentor, not out front, but present in the room to model the skeptical curiosity he now prized. The classroom became an incubator for the kind of questions that had changed Rick, curiosity that did not abandon rigor. Amanda asked about moral consequences. A philosophy major worried aloud that introducing a non-material layer would undercut social responsibility. Rick pushed back gently. "If anything," he said, "this model could reinforce responsibility. If you imagine a continuous self or a pre-existing awareness, the stakes of harm may feel different." He did not insist. He posed the thought as an intellectual experiment, mapping out consequences rather than proclaiming moral directives. Word of the seminar predictably leaked. A local podcast with an appetite for boundary-pushing interviews did a short piece on the course, and audio snippets reached a broader audience. The story, careful and cautious, morphed as stories do. Headlines softened or sharpened depending on the outlet. The phrase alien influence did not help the nuance. For Rick, it was familiar grief, ideas simplified into slogans. He had expected misinterpretations. He had not expected personal attacks. Dr. Stevens, never one to maintain a detached moderation in public, published a pointed op-ed that framed Rick's inquiry as an epistemic error that risked confusing students and the public. The confrontation with Stevens was inevitable. They met on a panel convened to discuss the scope of scientific inquiry into consciousness. The auditorium smelled of coffee and expectation. Stevens behaved with the grim courtesy of someone defending the borders of a discipline. He read from peer-reviewed literature that upheld neural emergentism and enumerated potential confounds for every anecdote Rick offered. The audience was a mixture of students, journalists, and faculty. Rick replied not with melodrama, but with the careful tone of someone trying to hold a plank between two worlds. He outlined the audit, the prospective protocols, and the need for cross-disciplinary methods. He did not invoke the ship that had shown him the golden timeline. He relied on the verifiable pieces: timelines of veridical perception reports, the archaeologist's dates, documented cases of terminal lucidity, and the brain's documented plasticity in extreme surgical cases. He invited replication, transparency, and adversarial collaboration. Stevens leveled the hammer of skepticism. "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence," he said, the line smooth and practiced. "You must demonstrate mechanisms, not metaphors." Rick honored the admonition. "Agreed," he replied. "But extraordinary anomalies deserve attention too. If you hand me an unexpected fossil, you do not light the museum on fire. You document, replicate, and test." It wasn't a victory. It was a posture, an invitation to treat anomalies with the tools of science rather than the reactive dismissal of ideology. The public coverage intensified. Social media amplified both the rancor and the reverence. Some commentators painted Rick as a traitor to the scientific method. Others hailed him as brave for questioning orthodoxy. He began receiving messages from strangers. Someone who had experienced an apparent NDE in a different country. A retired paramedic recalling a patient who described floating above a ward. A woman who said she had always remembered being someone else. Rick's inbox filled with stories that were sometimes moving, sometimes unverifiable, sometimes clearly shaped by expectation. He filtered them. He saved what seemed verifiable. He replied with a standard practiced kindness that avoided encouragement of flimsy claims but also avoided crude dismissal. The pattern of correspondence itself became data. People who report such experiences often do so with a mix of humility and insistence. Many do not seek public validation. In the months that followed, a cautious pattern emerged in Rick's public work. He published a measured review in a reputable interdisciplinary journal that summarized the anomalies he'd assembled and the protocols for prospective testing. The paper was careful to highlight limitations, to cite critics, and to emphasize that the dual origin model, body evolving via natural selection, and consciousness exhibiting features consistent with non-locality, was a hypothesis in need of rigorous testing rather than a replacement for Darwinian explanation. Some reviewers called the paper courageous. Others called it misguided. The practical consequence was that colleagues who had been friendly in the hallways became hesitant to be quoted alongside him. Funding committees were prudently conservative. Yet there was also a grassroots interest, a network of clinicians and archaeologists willing to exchange data under proper anonymization and methodological oversight. Where the debate tightened most insistently was in the space between brain plasticity and terminal lucidity. Neurologists shared cases where severely damaged brains nonetheless supported remarkable acts of cognition. Children whose hemispheres compensated admirably. Patients who spoke with clarity in final hours after months of decline. Rick did not frame these as miracles. He cast them as puzzle pieces. Why did the capacity for complex expression sometimes survive structural degradation? Was there a model in which an interface-like brain could account for surprising continuity of personality even when much of the hardware was disrupted? Amanda's thesis explored exactly that junction. She interviewed families of terminally lucid patients and synthesized their accounts with neurological data that Rick and Dr. Marquez helped obtain. The result was a careful, empathetic thesis that did not leap to metaphysical claims, but did argue for more nuanced models that could incorporate both the extreme plasticity of biological substrates and the stubborn persistence of certain patterns of identity and memory. Amanda's work won a small departmental prize, and, more importantly to Rick, it opened dialogue with clinicians who until then had avoided metaphysics. Sarah, for her part, began to process her experience in reflection rather than drama. The teenage immediacy of her initial report gave way to something more adult. A careful, sometimes humorous, reappraisal of what it meant to live with a knowledge that felt like a gift and a burden. She returned to art school with a tempered intensity, creating work that sometimes suggested corridors and light without being literal. At home, father and daughter moved toward an intimacy that was less about defending positions and more about listening. Rick found that the relationship he had almost lost became a site for small, steady repair. The alien, the pale gray being of the mountain night, did not come back in the way of sequels and grand reveals. Once, in a dream, Rick caught a fragment of the golden timeline, a shimmer that suggested points of decision, tiny choices that looked like threads. He woke with his hands clenched around the edge of the mattress and a sudden humility about the scale of what he did not know. The alien's message, when he remembered it, felt less like a secret he had to prove and more like a hypothesis he had the obligation to test with rigor and with care for human lives. Publicly, Rick learned a new posture. To be brave enough to ask unsettling questions and disciplined enough to let evidence, not conviction, guide his claims. He began to lecture not about certainties, but about the ethics of inquiry. How we treat anomalous reports, how to design robust tests, and why interdisciplinary humility is not capitulation. He emphasized that invoking a non-material dimension did not negate natural selection. It reframed the question of origins from an either-or to a layered inquiry. Darwin, he would remind audiences, had transformed how we see biological cause. Perhaps the longer view required we ask additional questions about where the subjective I fits in a story that includes both genes and apparent discontinuities. Time, as it always does, conspired to complicate and to clarify. Rick's dossier grew not into a tidy proof, but into a thicker book. Citations, case summaries, fieldwork notes, and careful methodological appendices. He wrote with restraint, often sitting for hours to prune language so that a cautious reader could not mistake suggestion for claim. He found a small press willing to publish a book that treated the subject as contested and interdisciplinary. The editor insisted on a title that would sell, and the inevitable headline called back to what had unsettled him most, a phrase used for marketing more than science that played up the alien dimension. Rick accepted because he understood the market realities and because the book itself was cautious in tone. He signed the contract with fingers that had once signaled no to speculative leaps. The book toured small venues. Panel discussions were sometimes civil and sometimes bruising. At one conference, a neuroscientist stood and offered data showing microcircuit resilience that, he argued, could accommodate many of the documented anomalies without invoking non-local consciousness. A philosopher retorted that resilience did not explain veridical perceptions during states of suppressed electrical activity. If such perceptions were verifiable, they asked for an account. The audience learned, painfully and fruitfully, to hold multiple lines of evidence without immediately reconciling them. For many listeners, the fascination was not whether the alien was real, but what it meant to let an unusual hypothesis change the way professionals approach hard questions about death, memory, and identity. Not everything went well. There were threats and ugly commentary. Someone left an anonymous package at the department mailbox that turned out to be a childish attempt at intimidation. Security took it seriously enough to escalate the matter. There were op-eds accusing Rick of endangering students by introducing fringe ideas. There were sympathetic letters from people who had never been heard before. He learned the blunt fact that shifting a public narrative invites both reasoned critique and ugly reflexes. He also learned to lean on the small network he had built. Dr. Marquez, Amanda, the archaeologist who had welcomed his questions, and a handful of clinicians who were willing to run a prospective protocol. The prospective study, boring and precise, yielded nothing spectacular in its first year. No hidden target veridical perception had been captured under ideal conditions. Some interpreted that as disconfirmation. Rick treated it as informative and consistent with the difficulty of measuring rare phenomena. He and his collaborators redoubled methodological rigor, reconsidered statistical power, and expanded the protocol ethically. The work was slow, sometimes infuriating in its lack of fireworks. It was, in other words, exactly what scientific labor looks like when it confronts inconvenient anomalies. Months after the book's release, Dr. Stevens called Rick to ask for a private conversation. It was not reconciliation. Few professional relationships fully mend from the friction of deep disagreement. The meeting took place in a campus cafe that smelled of burnt coffee in autumn. Stevens, blunt as ever, admitted that the debate had been good for the field in unexpected ways. "You forced us," he said, "to clarify what counts as evidence." It was not an endorsement of Rick's hypothesis. It was, nonetheless, an acknowledgement that asking questions can refine boundaries even when they are resisted. The personal consequences were quieter but perhaps more profound. Rick often found himself listening differently. To the pause between a patient's words, to the way students described meaning, to the hesitant testimony of a parent who had lost a child. He was not less scientific, he was more humane. The alien's image, two timelines aligning rather than one single origin, had softened his interactions. It had not converted him into a mystic, it had broadened his sense of responsibility. In Amanda's graduating year, she presented a small pilot study that mapped families' reports of memory continuity across generations. It was not definitive. It was suggestive. It showed how cultural frameworks shape recall and how some narratives persist in ways that defy simple reduction. Amanda's defense was rigorous and empathetic. Rick sat in the back and felt an odd pride. The seminar he helped foster had created a space where curiosity and skepticism could coexist without rancor. The public appetite for a tidy story did not vanish. Headlines still sought scandalous clarity. Readers wanted solutions rather than provisionality. Yet out of the noise came quieter changes. Medical teams that had been rigid about dismissing subjective reports began to consider documenting them more systematically, if only to rule out simple explanations. A hospice program invited Rick to speak about terminal lucidity in a meeting about end-of-life care. No wild metaphysics, just a request to consider how narratives of continuity might inform compassionate practice. If the alien's transmission had been a test, it had been an ethical one as much as an epistemic one. What do you do with a hypothesis that disturbs your intellectual life and your family life? Rick's answer was neither to run to certainty nor to retreat to the comfortable castle of professional orthodoxy. He chose the slow, difficult work of inquiry, of building protocols, of inviting critique, and of taking care. Near the end of his year of public dialogues, a journalist asked him a simple, unavoidable question during an interview. Do you believe consciousness predates the body? He paused, knowing that whatever he said would be quoted. I believe, he answered, that there are anomalies, patterns of reports, documented cases, that are consistent with the hypothesis that consciousness may not be fully explained by neurogeneration alone. I do not believe we have proof. I do believe we have reason enough to study the question more carefully and with more humility than we typically do. It was an answer that left room for doubt, for critique, and for further work. It also made room for a public ethic that treated anomaly with charity. In quieter moments, Rick still felt the echo of the pale gray figure and the gold-lit timeline. Those images had disturbed him in the way a fossil can disturb a theory. They suggested a hidden chamber under a house you thought you knew. He had not solved the mystery. No one had. The work had changed him, though. His lectures had acquired a quality of interrogation rather than assertion. His conversations with students had a tone of humility. His relationship with Sarah was less guarded, more present. As the first anniversary of the mountain road approached, Rick and Sarah drove out to the overlook again. Not to recreate the scene, but to sit with the thin, ordinary consolation of the sky. They watched a meteor cross the dark with the indifferent beauty of a planet-sized spark. Do you ever wish, Sarah began, searching for the right words, that you could tell me what it all means? He looked at her and felt the weight of the question not as a demand for explanation, but as the honest facing of an irreducible mystery. I used to think science was about ending questions, he said. Now I think it's more often about refining them. Maybe the better question is what we do with answers we can't yet prove. She smiled, an art student's small, knowing smile. So keep asking, she said. He nodded, yes, and keep being here. The last chapters of Rick's public story did not provide a tidy closure. The alien's answer remained an interpretive frame, provocative and unsettling. The dossier he had built, clinical audits, archaeological summaries, and documented reports, continued to demand further work. Some of his colleagues warmed to the interdisciplinary projects. Others recoiled. The academic world trudged on, as it must, making small corrections and, sometimes, stubbornly preserving familiar definitions. The public equally assimilated the story into its wider appetite for mystery and meaning. In lecture halls, Rick began to end his classes differently. Instead of concluding with a confident summation of emergentist orthodoxy, he would present the dual line model as a live question. He would draw the gray timeline of bones and the golden thread of luminous points, carefully noting the provisional quality of the latter. He would then ask students to design tests, ethical, robust, imaginative, that could move the hypothesis from speculation to a pathway of rigorous inquiry. The students responded with projects that were sometimes brilliant, sometimes naive, always ambitious in the ways young minds are. One final image came to him late one night as he prepared another lecture. Not the cinematic holograph the alien had shown him, but a quieter overlay. He imagined a human silhouette, everyday, ordinary, overlain with a faint glimmer of gold, like a heat haze or a signal that doesn't interfere with sight but is present to anyone paying attention. The image was not proof. It was an ethical prompt. If there is even a chance that the conscious presence we encounter in others is other than purely the anatomy before us, how do we live differently? The question was unanswerable in any absolute sense, which made it no less urgent. He wrote a short closing note to the readers of his book that attempted to capture the posture he had adopted: respect for evidence, humility before mystery, and a commitment to the painstaking work of inquiry. He warned against easy certainty and against the hubris of turning a beautiful hypothesis into dogma. He encouraged clinicians and archaeologists and philosophers alike to continue with disciplined curiosity. And he offered one practical invitation. If the reader wanted to explore the materials with the same caution that had guided him, a modest ebook with annotated references and suggested protocols would be available in the pinned comment of the interview pages. An archive for those who wish to study rather than to be satisfied by headlines. The alien's answer had disturbed him. That disturbance had not demolished his respect for Darwin. It had expanded the question of origins into a layered conversation in which bones and possible pre-existing consciousness both had a voice. Darwin had explained how bodies could be honed by natural processes. The alien suggestion, whether literal or a narrative device, asked what, if anything, lay on the other side of the window. A field of awareness, choosing, aligning, and entering where conditions favored complex integration. Rick never renounced skepticism. He kept running controlled studies, attending conferences, and inviting critics to read his files. He also never returned to the complacent certainty of his early career. The world after the mountain night felt both smaller and vaster. Smaller because he had lost the comfort of a single tidy origin. Vaster because the question of who we are now included the breathtaking possibility that the mind's story might begin before the body's. On one last page, he placed a question to the readers. Not a demand, but an invitation to thought and action. If the notion that consciousness may predate the body challenges us ethically and intellectually, what changes in how we teach, how we care, how we live? He left the question open, refusing to convert the reader by proclamation. The alien's answer, he wrote, is not an answer so much as a provocation, a disturbance that asks us to look again at what we thought we knew. Outside his office window, freshmen walked with their schedules, untroubled by the layered past that might undergird their feet. Rick watched them a moment and felt a quiet resolve to continue the slow, disciplined work of inquiry and to treat each human counterparty with the courtesy that comes from imagining that consciousness might, in some sense, have a history beyond the skull. On one last page, he placed a question to the readers, not a demand, but an invitation to thought and action. If the notion that consciousness may predate the body challenges us ethically and intellectually, what changes in how we teach, how we care, how we live? He left the question open, refusing to convert the reader by proclamation. The alien's answer, he wrote, is not an answer so much as a provocation, a disturbance that asks us to look again at what we thought we knew. Outside his office window, freshmen walked with their schedules, untroubled by the layered past that might undergird their feet. Rick watched them a moment and felt a quiet resolve to continue the slow, disciplined work of inquiry and to treat each human counterparty with the courtesy that comes from imagining that consciousness might, in some sense, have a history beyond the skull. If this story has stirred something in you, curiosity, skepticism, or the desire to learn more, there is a small resource compiled from the dossier, case notes, and suggested protocols available as an annotated ebook in the pinned comment. Subscribe to follow the carefully documented work and tell us in the comments, have you encountered something that made you question where consciousness comes from? Share one careful detail, and the conversation continues. The phrase that had once felt like a provocation, the alien answer to human evolution, what they've revealed will disturb you, was not an endpoint but an invitation. Disturbance, properly handled, can refine inquiry rather than collapse it. What will you do when you learn your mind may predate your body?